All right, so we've now talked a little about plant tissues. We've talked about what makes a plant. Now I want to talk about plant reproduction. How do plants make new plants? And it's all going to come down to this idea of the alternation of generations. We did talk about alternation of generations a little tiny bit when we talked about protists. Plant reproduction is still based on the constraints of plants as they left the water. Um, Colonizing the land meant that you don't have access to water all the time, so plants had to keep it all internally. They also had to reproduce on the land. Now, remember, for animals, we had some intermediary forms like amphibians. Plants didn't get that option. Basically, they were up on land and they just had to survive there to begin, like on the beginning. In order to adapt, they created this new form of reproduction called the alternation of generations. I'm going to explain it broadly, and then I'll go into steps. Basically, you have an egg and a sperm. You guys should be familiar with those at this point. They fuse together to make a zygote. That zygote then undergoes many, many rounds of mitosis. So you have an N and an N make a 2N. The 2N zygote undergoes mitosis to make exact copies of itself to build a multicellular 2N individual. Identical cells. They all have the exact same genome. That sporophyte stage produces spores, sporophyte spores. It actually makes a mother spore that undergoes meiosis to produce haploid spores. Each of these haploid spores are genetically unique. The haploid spores then undergo many rounds of mitosis. So haploid spores undergoing mitosis make many, many, many more haploids that are genetically identical. Those genetically identical spores spores in the gametophytes form what's called the gametophyte stage, a multicellular haploid component. Those gametophytes release identical gametes. So in you expend an enormous amount of energy producing genetically unique gametes. You may not want all of them, but you do. You produce them. Plants spend a lot of energy producing a genetically unique gamete that then lands, and that gamete does a whole bunch of work to produce a whole bunch more of it. Imagine, if you will, I don't know, you dropped an egg or a sperm on the ground, and it grew up into an egg or sperm tree that then gave out lots and lots of eggs and sperm everywhere. Once you dropped it, your work was done. Then that tree did all the work to produce lots and lots of gametes. When we get to ecology, we'll start getting into the difference between those organisms that are going to produce a whole bunch of offspring or a whole bunch of sex cells, and those that produce few and devote a lot of resources. For plants, I assume you've seen a dandelion, right? Dandelions produce a lot of seeds. Yes? Corn produces a lot of seeds. Of those seeds that are produced, how many are actually going to take root? How many are going to survive? What percentage? High or low? Very low. Low percentage of seeds will survive. Of our offspring, if any one of you was to get into the process of having a child that you wanted, what are the odds of you going to term? Pretty high compared to a dandelion surviving, because we devote more resources as organisms, as animals, to the development of our offspring. We have far less offspring, but they're more likely to survive. This, producing lots and lots of gametes, was critical to colonization of land. Yes?
So is that RNK type?
That is actually, that's exactly, we're going to get into that at the end of the course. You are exactly right, and we're going to get there. But yes, that's exactly the idea. RNK species. So, think of it this way. One plant managed to survive. It gets out on land. Life is good for that one plant. If it was like an animal, it might produce 6 other plants that then start growing around it. Time goes on, more plants, very slowly spreads. Or with this alternation of generations life cycle, one plant lands on the soil, it grows, and produces thousands upon thousands of offspring that can then colonize very quickly. It's how the land went from being rock to covered in green within just a few 100,000 years. That's the alternation of generations. So these early land plants had a distinct advantage when colonizing the land because they could produce so many offspring so quickly and with so low levels of energy. They had many, many, many more gametes. This is the bottom of a fern. You can see this is where the spores are going to be formed. Lots and lots and lots of gametes allowed them to colonize extremely. It also let them develop very specific structures, like you can see here, for specific functions. Those structures that the early land plants developed were the sporophyte stage, which is sort of the taller stage, and the gametophyte stage, the smaller stage. What you're looking at on the screen is the alternation of generations of moss. And we talked a little about the bryophytes last week. So you've got gametes. The gametes are going to fuse together to produce a zygote. The zygote goes on to produce the sporophyte. The sporophyte produces spores. The spores produce a gametophyte. The gametophyte produces more gametes. Starting at this stage, they're going to start over here at 1. 1 is the sporophyte stage of the moss. From there, the sporophyte is going to release spores. These spores are going to be the spores are going to be genetically unique. They're going to land to form the gametophyte, which is the a multicellular haploid structure. The gametophyte is then going to produce gametes that fuse to form the sporophyte, which then grows even more to produce more spores, and the cycle goes on. Those gametophytes produce the gametes. Shouldn't be difficult. The gametophytes, they produce identical gametes. This is actually, it's not Mark Kelly, is it? I forget which. So these guys are astronauts. They sent one of them up in the space shuttle, had him orbit the Earth for a year. They left the other one on Earth, and they compared them when they got back. That's what space does to you. It's required in space, apparently. The structure that produces gametes is called the gametangia. And you can see here that it's going to be a rapid mitotic area. We got two types of gametangia. You got the archegonium and the antheridium. This is the archegonium on the left. The archegonium is the male gametes. The antheridium is the male gametes. The archegonium over here is the female gamete. And I really want to get into the structures. If we were to look at these gametes, especially the archegonium, what you'll notice is that the archegonium and the antheridium are, in fact, haploid cells. Those haploid cells are going to form around a diploid central zygote when fertilization occurs. Here we've got the archegonium. You can see that it's got this vase shape to it. And this was important for this plant's early evolution because you keep your egg cell protected down in the bottom. The sperm will land at the top and then swim down until it meets the egg. Surprising. Sperm and eggs always need sperm always needs to swim to the eggs, usually. The sperm are produced in the antheridia, which tends to sort of overhang and just disperse. It's always weird. Usually with female sex cells, the eggs, They tend to be protected, and you keep them on, they keep them with you. Life is good. They're treasures. Sperm cells, whatever, throw them out to the wind. If the plant has water in its archegonium, so this whole area is moist, the sperm will land. It will then mature very quickly, swim down the archegonium, and fertilize the egg. Because of this, it is vital for plants to have water. If the archegonium does not have water, there will be no fertilization. It's desiccated. The plant sex organs will die. That sperm can swim because it's flagellated. Swims down the archegonium and fertilizes the egg. Questions on that? Awesome. Once we get that fertilization event, we've gone from we've had our gametophytes produce our gametes. The gametes have fused to produce the zygote. The zygote then develops into the sporophyte. The sporophyte will then produce spores that go on to create the gametophyte, and the process continues. Those diploid zygotes are going to stay encased in gametophyte tissues, so even though your zygote itself is 2N, the tissue around it is N. And then that leads to the formation of an embryo. That is, the zygote begins to develop. So all land plants, every single plant that you've seen on land is termed an embryophyte because it's going to produce unique embryos. So far, so good. These embryos fully depend on maternal development. Like I said, so you protect that archegonium. So the archegonium has the egg in it. The sperm fertilizes the egg, and the egg begins to develop inside the archegonium. It's drawing nutrients from the mother plant. That process is called matrotrophy. That is, quite literally, you're eating your mother. You display matrotrophy too. As you develop, you got your nutrients from your mother. Unless you grew up in an incubator, which, I don't know what your life was like. So all land plants display matrotrophy. They all feed on their mother originally to develop. Any of the nutrients from a seed come from the mother plant. Having offspring, and this is what we'll talk about when we talk about ecology, is energetically difficult. It requires a ton of energy. None of you guys have kids, right? Does any of you have kids? Yeah. It requires energy, right? It requires effort. You don't have kids? All right, well then fine. I'll tell you, you guys suck. It's hard to raise a kid. It requires a lot of energy. You don't sleep much. My daughter went to homecoming this weekend. And that meant that I had to stay up until 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning to make sure she got home when she was supposed to get home. I could have just not made sure, but that wouldn't have been me making sure my child is able to get to that stage where she herself can reproduce to pass on my genes to the next generation. Yes. Yeah, I know, right? You would let her crash? Yeah. And that's why my children are going to go on to succeed. Right. So there we go. Cells in the sporophyte then undergo meiosis to produce genetically varied haploid cells called spores that go on to land. Gametophyte. They're produced in the sporangia. Sporangia are these specialized structures that their whole job is to let spores out into the world. They are thick-walled. Sometimes they're usually thick-walled. They're thick-walled to keep pathogens out, so you don't want to get to get damaged by bacteria and such. But also, they're thick-walled in order to stop ultraviolet radiation. Because, guys, what does UV light do? Sure, burns. What? It kills because it's cancerous. What it'll end up doing is UV light will create photodimers that lead to damage to the DNA. It kills the cells by basically causing the cells' machines to turn on and say, oh, too much damage to the DNA. We got to stop reproducing. We got a few different dispersal mechanisms. I like this one. This one's with teeth. This is just a sporangia. This is a very close up. And basically what happens is it grows and it bends over. And then as wind blows across this, it shakes back and forth. It's the equivalent of, I'll show you, back here at the sink. If I turn this on, right? So it could just be pouring in one direction like this. But if you put those teeth in there, it starts to, in the wind blows, it spreads it out farther. So that's one form of dispersal. Another are these sort of bell-like, and these bell structures, back to the sink, these bell structures, literally when the wind is blowing, shake the leaf back and forth so water gets everywhere. You disperse it farther apart. As you disperse farther apart, these plants begin to grow everywhere. It's how plants colonize the land. So we can put this all together by using moss. Mosses are bryophytes. They are one of the simplest land plants. Bryophytes, you've probably seen them all over the place. We looked at them in lab last week. They're going to typically grow in moist environments. So like if you got a crack and water pools in that crack, you'll get moss growing. You don't need much in the way of soil. You'll see these oftentimes in not in direct sunlight. Cool environments. Typically in moss, what you're looking at is the gametophyte stage. Is the gametophyte diploid or haploid? Haploid, yes. If you look closer, sometimes during certain parts of the year, you'll see the sporophyte growing out of that. The sporophyte's usually taller because it's going to release spores. Those spores need to travel farther. The higher up you are, the farther dispersal you can get. Mosses can't grow tall. You'll notice that all the mosses you've ever seen and all the mosses that have ever existed on the earth to our knowledge have been very, very low to the ground. That's because they have certain biological constraints to them. Basically, they do not have any what's called conductive tissue. They don't have any tissue they don't have any straws in them to suck water up. The only way bryophytes get water is through osmosis. So they have to be either in water or near water to suck up the water. They can't get it. They can't grow thick because the thicker you are, the harder it is to disperse water through the system. So they got to be really thin. They've got to be really short and near water. Without water, they die extraordinarily quickly. You also can't get them to grow very tall simply because of they don't have that, like the other tissues that other plants have, that is termed vascular tissue. Basically, they don't have the only thing holding up a moss is the strength of the cell wall. So if you stack a cell on top of another cell on top of another cell, it gets really heavy. I put water balloons up here because if you can imagine a cell as a water balloon, if I put two water balloons on top of each other, what's going to happen? Not much. Not yet. They sort of start flattening out. You add 3 water balloons, 4, 5, you just got a big tower of water balloons. At some point, what will happen to the water balloons on the bottom? They will pop because there's too much weight on them, too much mass. Same thing will happen to the moss cells. So they just cannot grow any taller than that. So that's mosses, early plants, and coming out on land. It's the alternation of generations life cycle.